A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. Sometime later, Jesus crossed over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that is, Lake Tiberias, and a huge crowd followed him, impressed by the signs he gave by healing sick people. Jesus climbed the hillside and sat down there with the disciples. It was shortly before the Jewish feast of Passover. Looking up, Jesus saw the crowd approaching and said to Philip, "Where can we buy some bread for these people to eat?" Jesus knew very well what he was going to do, but asked this to test Philip's response. Philip answered, "Not even with 200 days' wages could we buy loaves enough to give each of them a mouthful." One of the disciples, Simon Peter's brother Andrew, said, "There's a small boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 dried fish. But what good is that for so many people?" Jesus said to them, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass there, and as many as 5,000 families sat down. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and gave them out to all who were sitting there. He did the same with the fish, giving out as much as they could eat. When the people had eaten their fill, Jesus said to the disciples, "Gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing gets wasted." So they picked them up and filled 12 baskets with the scraps left over from the 5 barley loaves. The people, seeing this sign that Jesus had performed, said, "Surely this is the prophet who was to come into the world." Seeing that they were about to come and carry him off to crown him as ruler, Jesus escaped into the hills alone. As evening approached, the disciples went down to the lake. They got into their boat, intending to cross to Capernaum, which was on the other side of the lake. By this time it was dark, and Jesus had still not joined them. Moreover, a stiff wind was blowing, and the sea was becoming rough. When they had rowed 3 or 4 miles, they caught sight of Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. They were frightened, but he told them, "It's me, don't be afraid." They were about to take him into the boat, but suddenly the boat was ashore at their destination. For sacred words of challenge and encouragement, thanks be to God.
A contemporary reading, Logos by Mary Oliver. Why worry about those loaves and fishes? If you say the right words, the wine expands. If you say them with love, and the felt ferocity of that love, and the felt necessity of that love, the fish explode into many. Imagine him speaking. And don't worry about what is reality, or what is plain, or what is mysterious. If you were there, it was all those things. If you can imagine it, it is all those things. Eat, drink, be happy. Accept the miracle. Accept, too, each spoken word spoken with love. For love and truth in contemporary expression, thanks be to God.
May I speak in the name of our wondrous God, who works wondrous things in their wondrous creation. I want to speak today about 3 things: about magical cats, about scarcity thinking and the famine of grace, and about sharing in miracles. First, however, a question. Do you know the rousing 19th century hymn, "Alleluia, Sing to Jesus"? The second verse, referring to the ascension of Christ, includes lines which have always struck me. "Alleluia, Christ is near us. Faith believes, nor questions how." Faith believes, nor questions how. How do you respond to that? In my case, I have to confess that I've always tended to sing that last part, not as faith believes nor questions how, but as faith believes and questions how. What do you think? In my view, how we respond helps determine whether we can overcome scarcity thinking and the famine of grace, and instead grow as magical cats, sharing in miracles. Why worry about the loaves and fishes? Wrote Mary Oliver. Imagine Christ speaking, and don't worry about reality. Accept the miracle. Accept to each spoken word spoken with love. With a poet's heart, Mary Oliver calls us into a faith response which is more than rational, but is not opposed to reason. Rather, like many of her poems, Mary Oliver is employing reason in the deepest sense, something that is more than rationality. She is using words spoken with love in order to enable us, like Jesus, to live into life in all its fullness. That is what Mary Oliver, in all her poems, is seeking, that we celebrate and become wondrous ourselves, living miracles, finding meaning with the whole of ourselves, and not simply managing life with our minds. Because we're invited to bring the whole of ourselves to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And we're invited to imagine, not just to scrutinize, but to imagine, to be enchanted, and to be transformed by love, not by mere rationality. The poor old Western mind, which is troubled by modernity's excessive and false illusions of scientific certainty, protests, and maybe it protests in you too. But when it is exaggerated, it struggles to birth the miracles of joy and justice which are possible and to which this gospel reading refers. For today's gospel reading just cannot be avoided if we want to have good news to share and to help birth fresh miracles of justice and joy. And that's partly because, biblically speaking, the feeding of the 5,000 is so central. 5,000, of course, that's only the recorded men. This feeding not only appears in all four Gospels, all of them, but Matthew and Mark also relate a story of how Jesus also fed 4,000 men, who knows how many more. Furthermore, in the next few weeks, the Common Lectionary takes us through John's account and his lengthy bread of life discourse. In John, it is also most evident that these feeding stories are intimately linked to the deep symbolism of the Jesus and Christian story, and not least, even though John does not have a narrative of the institution of what we call Holy Communion, deeply leading us into this huge feast, the Feast of Grace. Because like the poet, this story in the Gospel invites us into profound and lively, sacramental ways of knowing, being, and living in the world. Sacramental. That's more than just rational, and it's more than fundamentalist. In other words, as Mary Oliver put it in another poem, we are called to be like wild geese, or as we might also put it, like magical cats. What do I mean by a magical cat? Well, the phrase is from one of my grandchildren who was here a couple of weeks ago and loved some of the songs we sang. So later in the day, she kept singing this Taizé chant, which she sang like this. We've sung it earlier, but you probably sang it as Magnificat. Magical cat, magical cat, magical cat, anima mea dominum. So was she wrong? Well, it's a bit like the prosaic details of Jesus' impromptu outdoor banquet for thousands. It depends on your attitude. If you're interested in merely calibrating the world and controlling yourself and everything, and in seeking the illusion of prosaic certainty, you will certainly say she was just wrong. If, however, you know or open to the possibility that we and our world are far more than we seem, and there are more dimensions than merely the rational, then you'll join in the song. If, like Mary Oliver, you're like wild geese, you'll give up the attempt just to control your life and world. You will mix poetry with rationality, love with life, and live sacramentally like a magical cat. Reflect upon it. If we share in Magnificat, are we not in doing so becoming a magnificent being? That's the purpose of singing it, not to give praise to something or whatever that may or may not exist beyond us. It's about that transformation into the magnificence of the love of God, making of our anima mea, your and my soul, magnificent beings, open to divine poetry, tapping into wonder and magnifying love in the world. That's why we sing, to share in that. Magnificat, living like a magical cat, embodying divine poetry, manifesting wonder, magnifying love in the world. Isn't that at the very heart of the life and teaching of Jesus? That's why we have this story, this magnificent story, and repeated, and why it's symbolized and expressed and embodied in the feast that we call communion or the Eucharist. This is key to the gospel feeding of the masses, understood sacramentally, because the story told by all the gospel writers symbolizes so much of what Jesus is and does. Think about it. Jesus is like a magical cat. Jesus magnifies. Jesus magnifies, makes more, that's what magnifies means, makes more of lives, of struggles, of hopes, of gifts, of dreams and possibilities. Now, if we just live in the world of rationality, we're missing something, aren't we? Because that's what happens if you live in Jesus, and Jesus' effect on the world is to magnify all of those things that are life-giving. For Jesus enlarges, Jesus lives wondrously, brings wonder, invites wonder. Jesus gives us, in other words, what we need to live, our daily bread, our true food, that which helps us to flourish, the magnificence of being a magnificent being, because Jesus invites us to feast in life. Oh dear, now we hit a problem for certain types of Christianity and certain other types of understanding and controlling the world, including some secular ones. Because rather than seeking flourishing and feasting together in life, human beings are too susceptible to scarcity thinking and to sharing the famine of grace. Because scarcity thinking is sadly embedded in so much of our religious and political outlooks. And it makes more sense when you look at history, because people had so little to live on, and it was a struggle, and it's understandable that that became part of our mentality. But where are we today? Where were we in Jesus' day? Scarcity thinking is represented, for example, in the assumption in many religious quarters that heaven, the realm of God, has a limited amount of room in it. There's scarcity. There's only a little bit of space. And it's reserved for those who behave according to supposedly God-given restrictions, which are about being a little bit scarce about how you live your life. It's seen in many political quarters in the deeply embedded assumptions that there is really only so much to go around. There's only one way or two or three ways of constructing the world, and that's it. There is limitations to what we can do and be, whether it's in terms of property and money, rights, peace or justice. There's a scarcity of these things, and we need to hold on to them if we're in rich countries and make sure we don't give away too much to others and we retain what we have. It's not just Donald Trump it is pervasive across the Western world. It's seen, for example, in the influential limiting idea that there is a limited pool, a scarcity of rights and sovereignty. So it's assumed if greater or even some rights and some sovereignty are given to one group of people, others must therefore suffer. Somebody must lose if some rights are given and sovereignty. Not that these things like love increase as you give them away, but that you're actually reducing it. So men must suffer if women gain rights. White people suffer if black people gain rights. Straight people must suffer if queer people gain rights. Traditionally dominant religious groups must suffer if other minorities gain rights, and so it goes on. Contemporary liberation theologians like Gerald Robinson Brown, in his book Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer, have rightly named this the famine of grace. And he writes out of a Wesleyan background, even though he's an Anglican priest now, because Wesley was so strong on the power of abundance. It's what grace is. It's not a way to judge a God that judges, it's a God that seeks abundance and flourishing. And Robinson Brown is clear on this because, as his book title highlights, scarcity thinking betrays the deeply intersectional nature of human beings and human connections. We are not boxed. We cannot box our life, or we deny truth and life itself. Because scarcity thinking is linked to the limited and imperializing ideas of God, life, and religion that we carry with us, constructed as they are on rationalizing unjust concepts and structures of supposed reality, and reducing the possibilities of human expression and cooperation. And that surely is the very opposite of the praxis of Jesus seen in the feeding of the masses. The feeding of the masses turns that upside down. It asks us to move way beyond scarcity thinking into the possibility of wonder and sharing. Rather than limiting food to the few, all and sundry are included. Rather than living and justifying famine, we have flourishing. Rather than scarcity, we have grace in abundance. So well may the poet say, why worry about the loaves and the fishes? Leave that, she says, to the religious and political rationalists, and to those who would deny the possibilities of feasting for the hungry and the outcast. Because if you ridicule the miracles, if you ridicule Jesus, then you keep scarcity thinking, don't you? You deny the possibilities that a people could rise, a people could be fed, there could be freedom, there could be life and justice. Instead, Mary Oliver says, share the felt ferocity. I love that phrase, the felt ferocity and the felt necessity of Christ's love. Imagine him speaking, and in the power of that love, it's not just about communion, in the power of that love, the wine of life expands, she says, and the fish explode into many, into a feast, not a famine. And isn't that what happens in our own lives and on the broader politics and everything else when love is felt, expressed and shared? Because then we stop rationalizing suffering and detachment, loneliness, injustice, and the famine of grace. We stop reducing the possibilities of human life. We stop living with scarcity thinking. We magnify grace, and we too share in our own miracles. Scarcity thinking and scarcity faith clings to us. We find it, I think, in ourselves and in our own families and communities, as well as in the wider world, and those who are ungracious and ungenerous to us and to others. Because singing like magical cats is one thing, isn't it? Living as magical cats is another. And that's the challenge. And that's why today's readings are so vital, and why perhaps we've got it repeated in some sense, or the next verses again in the next few weeks. Because John's bread of life discourse is so central. They are an invitation, these readings, into grace, about sharing the feast of love with everyone, not hoarding and inflicting a famine of grace on others. So happily, and that's the purpose of next month to some degree liturgically, we'll share an intentional season of gratefulness in the next few weeks as a way of trying to strengthen ourselves as magical cats, as part of our way to magnify divine love amongst us, to share the bread of life, and hopefully to contribute to some miracles of love and life and justice possibilities in our world. In the meantime, may we be freshly drawn into this wonder of the miracle of life, into God's extraordinary generosity and the transformative possibilities open to us. I'm going to draw to a conclusion now, but as we've also heard Mark's story of Jesus walking on the water this morning, let me also share a story one of my favourite bishops used to tell against himself. Because David Jenkins, when he was Bishop of Durham, used to be under fire for his sacramental rather than strictly literal interpretation of miracles. Because David wasn't interested in what he called a laser beam God who would periodically intervene from above. Rather, he profoundly believed, as I do, that the whole of reality was and is and always will be full of the power of God's love and its miraculous possibilities. Not sometimes for some people, but always everywhere, even when it's denied. And this for me is at the core of true Christian hope, justice and joy. Many people don't understand that, and whether they're religious or atheist, they become distracted by incidentals, like how many loaves and fishes there were and how they expand. Reasonable to ask that, but we have to go beyond that. This is, said Bishop David, how it would be if a leading rabbi, a leading imam, and the Bishop of Durham went out rowing to the middle of a lake and we lost our oars. Firstly, the rabbi would get out and swim to the shore. Then the imam would get out and swim to the shore too. Then, perhaps, when I gathered strength, I'd be seen stepping out onto the water and walking to shore. And what would the media make of this? Well, they would say, Bishop of Durham can't swim. So in the face of today's gospel text, of course, ask questions. Always ask questions of the biblical text, always. Faith and doubt are not enemies, but they're siblings together on the road. But don't let them lead us into scarcity or the famine of grace. Let us not deny the truly miraculous, our sense of wonder, our magical cat. The last verse of Alleluia, Sing to Jesus, begins like this. Alleluia, bread of heaven, come back to that again. Here on earth, our food, our stay. Because like the ascension properly understood, the heart of faith is a giving away, a letting go into all, even to all the cosmos. It's a sharing in divine poetry, a magnifying of love, a maximizing of gratitude and generosity, and a living into the possibilities of the feast of life. So may it be for us all, in the name of Christ, the bread of life. Amen.